and welcome to the Pagan Portal podcast, produced by Moonbooks Publishing and presented by me, Rachel Patteson. If you prefer an audio-only version, hop on over to Spotify. If you would like sneak peek early looks at what we're doing, do consider subscribing over on YouTube, and please do hit the subscribe button if you are on YouTube as well. Today we welcome priestess and founder of Ariadne's tribe, Laura Perry. Welcome.
Hi. Happy to be here.
I did pronounce that correctly, didn't I?
You did.
I was a bit nervous about pronouncing words I'm not used to.
It was a tongue twister. It throws a lot of people.
If we can start with the usual question, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am the founder and temple mom of Ariadne's tribe, which is a worldwide inclusive Minoan spiritual tradition. We are a polytheist and animist group working to revive Minoan spirituality in the modern world in relationship with the deities. And there are many deities, not just one great goddess, but a whole pantheon full of them.
We like lots of choice.
Yes.
So how and when did your own spiritual journey start?
With the Minoans, that was back when I was a teenager taking an art history class. And we had this textbook. It was really intimidating for anyone who's old enough to remember what an unabridged dictionary looks like. That's how big the textbook was for this class. But it had these clumps of glossy color plates in it, reproductions of art from around the world and across time. And the teacher was having us look at some of these color plates one day, and I was flipping through them, not exactly following along with what I was supposed to be doing, but because they were pretty, right? And it was everything from cave art all the way up to the Renaissance. And I was flipping these pages on these color plates, and I came to one that was the Bull Leaper fresco from Knossos. So this is a Minoan wall painting. Most people have probably seen pictures of it. It has a blue background with this big tan and white spotted bull charging across the front of it, and three people doing acrobatics over the bull. And I went goosebumps all over just looking at this picture, and something clicked. And I'm old enough that this was back when there was no internet. So I
remember those times.
Yes. So I found myself like scouring through encyclopedias and books in the library. But yeah, that was the catalyst moment. Sitting there in a classroom, staring at a picture of a 3,500-year-old fresco.
Light bulb moment. So with the Ariadne's tribe, how did that come about?
I had written my first Minoan-themed book, which was the first edition of Ariadne's Thread, published by Moonbooks back in 2013. And the stuff in that book I had developed as I was part of a local group, a pagan group, but they weren't really focused on the Minoan stuff. They were just generous and kind enough to like help me work through some of it and figure out the rituals. So I was feeling a little lonely, and I went on Facebook, and I thought, okay, maybe I can find a couple dozen other people, right, who might be interested. Because I mean, let's face it, paganism itself is kind of niche, and then Minoan spirituality within paganism is even more niche. So I started a Facebook group, and I thought, okay, maybe I'll get, a couple dozen people and we can hang out and talk about this stuff. And it just kind of grew organically. I wasn't advertising it or anything, but it just kept expanding, and it became a community. We've got, I think, 1,600 members now. But yeah, and so as we were having our conversations in this group, people said, well, let's make it formal. Let's create, an actual tradition. Instead of just talking about it, let's do it. And so as a community, with me as sort of the facilitator, the project manager, whatever you want to call that, that's what we did.
Brilliant. I love how things, evolve like that.
Yes.
That's brilliant.
Yes.
I guess we ought to start with the question, who were or are the Minoans?
They were. They do not exist anymore. Their descendants still live on Crete, among other people. So the Minoans were a Bronze Age culture on the island of Crete, which is just south of Greece in the eastern Mediterranean Sea. So it's like between the south end of Greece and the Nile Delta in Egypt. So that gives you an idea of where it's located. The Minoans were a vibrant, colorful culture. We still have a lot of their art that has thankfully survived. They were wealthy. They traded all over the place. They were a seafaring culture. They were very, the sea was very important to them. Because, I mean, living on an island, that's kind of obvious. But yeah, so they were fairly typical of Bronze Age. And by Bronze Age, I mean like 3000 to 12 or 1300 BCE, that time period. They were fairly typical of the cultures in that area in terms of the fact that they were polytheistic. They were farmers and sailors. You know, they lived on the land and on the sea as pretty much everybody did. There are a few things that set them apart. As far as anyone has been able to determine, they did not have a military. They were not bent on conquest. So they lived on an island. They were centered on an island, and so they didn't have borders to deal with. And so they had the luxury of being able to be kind of neutral and trade with everybody and not threaten anybody. And so that allowed them to become very successful. And one other interesting thing that we have discovered about them is they appear to have carried on Neolithic religious practices into the Bronze Age. So the Neolithic is the period when agriculture first developed, and that's around 10,000 to 9,000 BCE in Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean. The Minoans' ancestors came down from Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey. They migrated to Crete and settled there around 10,000 to 9,000 BCE. And so that was during the Neolithic. That's the earliest farmers. And they kind of clung to a lot of their older traditions. Their religion incorporates a lot of stuff having to do with caves and stones and things that you don't really see when you get into like Mesopotamia and Egypt. So their neighbors probably thought of them as like those weird old-fashioned people who still did that stuff that nobody does anymore. You know, so
I think my neighbors think that of me as well.
So that kind of set them apart, but they were still very much an integral part of the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean back then. So
to be able to find all of that information is always fascinating as well, isn't it? Do we know much about how they lived, or how do we know all of that information?
Almost all of it we know from archaeology. The Minoans were actually a literate culture, but we can't read the stuff they wrote. We can't, it hasn't been deciphered. Yeah.
That's a bit of a hiccup.
Yes. So they wrote in a script called Linear A. Whoever named it was totally unimaginative, but toward the end of Minoan civilization. So I have to go a little history teacher on you here for a minute. So in the Eastern Mediterranean, there is this island called Santorini. And in the ancient world, it was called Thera. And it is a volcanic island, meaning there is a super volcano caldera underneath it. And in around the year 1600 BCE, it blew majorly. It literally blew a hole out of the middle of the island and generated tsunamis that scoured the coast around the entire Eastern Mediterranean, Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and all the islands. It was bad. Ash cloud, the whole bit. People probably thought it was the end of the world. And for a long time, people thought that destroyed Minoan civilization. But we have since learned that they rebuilt and continued on for a couple more centuries after that. Okay, but that kind of destroyed their economy because, right, they had been extremely successful traders, and that gave the Mycenaeans, who were the early Greeks, the opportunity to come down from Greece and kind of insinuate themselves into the economy of the island. And they eventually took over at Knossos, which was the largest of the Minoan cities, and they tried to take over the whole island. And so the Minoans already knew how to write, and the examples of their writing that we have are on little clay tablets that were like the notepads that the temple accountants used, right? And so they have, and they're little. They're like the size of your hand. They're not huge, like Charlton Heston, the 10 Commandments kind of tablets. They're like this big. And the Mycenaean Greeks, the early Greeks, did not know how to write. So the Minoans taught them. And they made a version. They sort of adapted their Linear A script into what's now called Linear B that was used to write Mycenaean Greek. And we can read that. That was translated in the 1950s. And so we have a little bit of information that's written on those Linear B tablets. Once again, it's accounting, like bookkeeping stuff, like the offerings that were brought to the temples and that kind of thing. So we have that. Bear in mind that the Mycenaeans were effectively an occupying force. So it's like they were in the same position as like the Romans in Druidic Britain. So they were an occupying force, not necessarily a friendly population, but we can read what they wrote. And so that gives us a view at least into those last couple centuries. We have names of deities from those tablets. We have names of, clergy positions, the kinds of activities and offerings that were made in the temples. So we have a good chunk of information about Minoan religion and, to some extent, their economy from those. But the majority of the information we have is from artifacts. There are dozens of Minoan cities that have been excavated, and more keep being found all the time. And so we have the bronze and ceramic vessels that people used. We have like their kitchen canisters and their dinnerware. We have the statues from people's shrines, not just in the temples, but in people's houses. It's really, it's really nifty to look and see that ancient pagans, just like modern ones, have like altars in their homes, little shrines, and they put not just like store-bought figurines and stuff, but seashells and the cups that they used in their kitchen, they would carry to the altar and make an offering. So it's really, it's touching, and it makes it feel, it gives me a feeling of connection with those people to see, the kinds of things that they did.
Absolutely. Yes, it's nice to know that we are following in footsteps.
Yes.
Brilliant. Archaeology is such a brilliant resource, though, isn't it, for all of these things? It's good that at least we have something. So you mentioned deities, and that there are a lot of deities. Can we start with Ariadne, actually? Because I mentioned her at the beginning. Who was Ariadne?
Okay, so a lot of the information that we have about the Minoan deities comes via the Greeks. Okay,
Right.
so it's very similar to the way that we know about the Celtic deities via the Romans.
Right.
Okay, so it's a very similar situation. And so when we were trying to figure out what the Pantheon really looked like, we had to start with a bit of skepticism, assuming that the information in the Greek myths that were passed down might very well have been changed on purpose. Most people know Ariadne from the story of the Minotaur and the Labyrinth. And so this is the story where there is a human king named Minos who lives at Knossos in a palace. And in the basement of this palace, he has this maze in which he has imprisoned a monster called the Minotaur. And Ariadne, in this version of the story, is Minos's daughter. And the hero of the Greek version of the story is a dude called Theseus, and he comes to Crete in order to stop the continual sacrifice of Greek teenagers, essentially, who King Minos is demanding to be sent and essentially fed to the Minotaur. And the whole story makes the Minoans look like some kind of monsters. And the Greeks look like these wonderful, civilized, polished people, right? So propaganda, right? That's pretty clear. So there was something that I didn't learn until a number of years after I had gotten into this, which is that Theseus is not Minoan. He did not exist in Minoan times. So the Minoans, their cities were destroyed in between about 1450 and 1300 BCE. Most of them were destroyed by the Mycenaeans, and then Knossos was destroyed in what may very well have been an uprising of the local people. And so by about 1300 BCE, there are no Minoan cities anymore. It's all like burned to the ground. People who are still on Crete are living in fairly chaotic and crude conditions and just surviving. And then for a couple hundred years, you've got what's called the Late Bronze Age collapse. Some people call this the Greek Dark Ages. And it was kind of like the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire. So there's like governments falling. You got all the climate crisis and famine and drought and all the usual sort of stuff that just piles on one thing after another. And then after that, around the year 900 to 800, you start to see the beginnings of what we think of as classical Greek civilization. And so that's hundreds of years after the end of the Minoans. Okay, and so any myths that did survive that time period survived purely in oral tradition. And then a couple hundred years after that, we see the first instance of Theseus show up in myths. Right, so he is a Greek culture hero, specifically associated with Athens. And his purpose is to help Athens become the preeminent city-state in Greece, because there were all these city-states who were vying to be the big one, right? And it's not until a couple hundred years after that that the Minotaur and Labyrinth story is added to his bunch of myths, because he already had a bunch of other myths. He has a fairly large collection of tales associated with him. So the Minotaur and Labyrinth story essentially is the Hellenic Greeks from Athens taking a bunch of mythic fragments that survived from Minoan times and using them to stitch together a story to help them reach their political goals.
Right. Right. Nothing changes, does it? That still happens in modern times.
Well, human's gonna human. Yeah. But and so we had to start looking behind that sort of thing and finding the threads that connect us back to what all of that probably looked like during Minoan times. And so we had a collection of different kinds of methods. We started with the archaeology and the fragments of myth that were available. One of our board members is a dance ethnologist, and she turned us on to the amazing amount of information that is still available in folk dance and folk music. Yes, some of it literally goes straight back to Minoan times. It's a treasure trove. And between that and some comparative mythology, we were able to find our way back to Ariadne as the Lady of the Labyrinth. So she is, it is her sister Arachne who the ball of string comes from, right? The fate goddess. But Ariadne is the one who guides us through the labyrinth, and the labyrinth is many things to many people. But the Minotaur is not a monster. He's one of our deities. So he is a face of the bull god, Taurus Asterion. And so instead of being a monster who's trapped in the labyrinth, the Minotaur guards it and makes it a safe space for those who travel in the labyrinth for spiritual journeys and healing.
That's brilliant. Yeah, what a
so-
flip. What a
Yes.
yeah, coming at
Yes.
it from a different and completely different angle.
Yeah. But yeah, the Ariadne is probably the best known of the Minoan deities, but our pantheon actually has I don't know, a couple dozen, 2-3 dozen deities total. So it is headed. So most people think of pantheons like a family tree, right? So we learned the
Yes.
Greek and the Roman pantheons, and they're organized like a human family tree.
Yeah.
Kind of helps us, keep track of all the stuff that all the deities are up to, right? Who's related to him. We can do that to some extent with the Minoan pantheon, but it's not as neat and tidy as the others. But at the top of our pantheon, instead of a father sky god, we have a trio of mother goddesses.
Okay, nice. I like that idea.
Pantheons and religions tend to reflect the culture that they belong to.
Right.
The Minoans were a matrilineal culture, and it makes sense that they would have female figures at the head of the family, so to speak. So we have a trio of goddesses. They represent the sacred realms of land, sky, and sea. So we have the Earth Mother Goddess Rhea, and the Sun Goddess Tarasia, and the Sea Goddess Poseidaia. And so that's the sort of the mamas of the pantheon. And then all the other deities are either faces of them or their children. And so, and we do actually have gods and not just goddesses. So there are three daughters, Ariadne, Arachne, and Anthea. Anthea is the Minoan face of Aphrodite. And there are 3 sons. There's Dionysus, Taurus Asterion, and Korydallos. And each one of those is the daughter or son of one of the 3 mother goddesses. So those deities are also connected with land, sky, and sea. And if you think about it, living on an island, the intersection of those 3 realms is sort of your constant background to life. So
you mentioned Dionysus then. Are there any crossover? Because we know him as a Greek god.
Right.
Is he one and the same, or are they separate?
Okay, so there are a lot of Minoan deities who were borrowed into the Hellenic pantheon. So the Minoan Dionysus, the Dionysus, let me come at this from the other direction. The Dionysus that we know from the Hellenic pantheon is a combination of 2 deities. He is a syncretic god who is a combination of the Minoan Dionysus and a Phrygian ecstatic god named Sabazios. And the 2 are very similar. and the in the Hellenic pantheon, they're sort of combined into a single deity. Yeah, there are other Minoan deities who were borrowed into the Hellenic pantheon. Rhea.
Yeah, I recognize that name.
Yeah, one of the ways that we found a lot of these was we looked at the Hellenic pantheon and we said, how many of these have stories that have the word Crete in them?
Bit of a telltale.
Yeah. The midwife goddess Aletheia is Minoan, and in fact, her name is associated with the Eleusinian mysteries, and scholars now think that there may have been a precursor to the Eleusinian mysteries in Minoan Crete.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The birthplace of a lot of the Greek stuff then by the looks of it.
Yeah, I mean, people have always borrowed. Yeah. Cultures have always borrowed stuff. The Minoans even, toward the end, borrowed a couple deities from Egypt. And the Egyptians borrowed from everywhere. So it's a very common
bit mix and match.
We're religious magpies in that sense.
I like that term. Yes, that works. Now, your book, you've got the book Pantheon, the Minoans. You mention a sacred calendar. Would the Minoans have worked with a calendar of sorts? And is it something that we would be familiar with today?
The calendar was very important to the Minoans. There is one of the sources of information that we use that I forgot to mention earlier is archaeoastronomy. And that means figuring out how ancient people connected with the sky and the celestial objects. Okay. There is a group of people at Uppsala University who did huge, vast amounts of research, all these research papers. And so we scrabbled our way through all of the academic writing and found out that the Minoans, when they built their temples and the temple buildings on the peaks, at the peak sanctuaries on top of the mountains, and even the buildings of the cave shrines, they all have astronomical alignments. And so what that means is that, so these buildings are designed so that when, say, the sun rises on a particular day, the light of it comes in through a specific doorway or illuminates something on a wall. So it becomes like a marker of that day as sacred. Most people have heard of the throne room at Knossos, right? It's a room that's got this central throne-like seat that's flanked by frescoes with griffins in them. That room has some amazing astronomical alignments. If you open specific doors in the front of the room at sunrise on winter solstice morning, a sunbeam shoots through the door and lights up that throne.
That's some clever tech. That's clever technology and building, and that's probably a lot of maths into that.
Yes. But I mean, can you imagine in a world with no electricity, where everything is totally just like oil lamps and torches, and here you are, a bunch of people gathered for a ritual just before dawn on solstice morning, and a priestess opens the door and the sunbeam shoots in and that central seat just lights up. I mean, it must have been just absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah, that is some clever working out of things, isn't it? We struggle with building proper houses these days with all the computers. That is some serious education, workings out. Yeah, very clever.
We took all the information of those astronomical alignments and kind of shuffled it together to see what the calendar might have looked like, because every single one of those dates for an astronomical alignment would have been important to them.
Yeah.
It turns out they probably had several different sacred calendars that they used in tandem, but we've kind of collated it into a single one because we're not that clever. some of them are very recognizable. Some of the festivals are very recognizable to modern pagans. The solstices and the equinoxes. I mean, that's just like the basis for every sacred calendar. A lot of the spots that we found have to do with what's called the heliacal rising of stars. And what that means is first thing in the morning, if you're up just as the sun, right, just before sunrise, right, just as the sky is starting to get light, but before the sun actually comes up, you can still see some stars just above the horizon. Okay. And some of those stars will be right in the spot where the sun's about to come up. And as the sun gets closer to coming up, it gets lighter right there, and those particular stars disappear. It looks like the sun eats them. So the heliacal rising of a star is the first time over the course of the year that you see a particular star in that spot right before the sun comes up. And this is the kind of thing that a lot of ancient cultures around the world watched for and used to calibrate their calendars. So sailing was real big with the Minoans, right? They had these amazing boats. They sailed all over the Mediterranean. So there was a sailing season. There still is in the Mediterranean. And the beginning of it corresponded to the time back then when the Pleiades had its heliacal rising. Okay, and that would have been about the middle of May. So we just passed that. And then the Pleiades has their heliacal setting back then in mid-October, which would have been roughly the end of the sailing season. The winds change and it becomes not really safe to sail. And so we have those two spots. We call them the blessing of the ships, which is the beginning, and then harbor home, which is the end of the sailing season. And there are still places around the Mediterranean that celebrate the beginning of the sailing season. In Venice, there's a huge flotilla, and the current religious clergy bless the ships. And so this is something that has continued in these seagoing cultures. But yeah, lots of. I suspect that the ancient Minoan sacred calendar was every bit as full as the Roman one or the Greek one. We just don't have that information. And so what we do have, we filled up what we could, and it's a fairly full calendar, but it still gives us a little breathing room for our modern lives.
So we have that information. We have, you said they found statues and from personal temples and from the larger temples. Do we know how the Minoans would have worshipped the deities?
We do, to a fairly great extent. We know a lot of their ritual activities based on the kinds of artifacts that we have found in sacred spaces. It looks like the single biggest aspect of their religion was making offerings. The two types of sacred, like, ritual ware that we find most often are offering stands and rhytons, which are the kinds of pitchers that are used to make libations, which are poured out liquid offerings. And there are so many of those. They're everywhere. There are even, there's some very interesting bits about offerings that have been found. For instance, there are a couple places where cup-like holes have been carved out of stone, like on boulders on the ground, and it is apparent that liquid offerings were poured into those. At Zakros, somebody made an offering of a plate of olives and dropped it down a well, and it wasn't just like thrown. It appears to have been lowered carefully so that it landed like in place with the olives still on the plate. It was clearly an offering. An archaeologist dug that up and found, someone offered a plate of olives to the spirit of the well or the source of the water, maybe. And in the lower levels, okay, so a lot of people have seen pictures of what the Minoan temples might have looked like, right? They have these round columns, rows of lots of those. So there were also square stone pillars inside in some of the rooms. And on the lower levels of the temples, some of these square stone pillars had little moats carved out around the base, like cut into the ground. And we think that's where offerings were poured to reach the ancestors, the spirits of the dead in the underworld, and deities of the underworld. So you're like you're sending it in that direction.
That makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense now. So yeah, did they made clearly offerings were a big thing to them. Did they work magic? Was spell casting a part of their culture?
Okay, so we don't have any hard evidence of that. However, we have textual evidence of belief in magic and working magic from surrounding cultures: Egypt, the Sumerian and Babylonian cultures, the Canaanite culture in the Levant. So it was standard operating procedure in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age to believe in magic and practice it. Usually, these days we see magical practitioners who do just the magic, separate from any kind of religious belief or activity. So that kind of separation didn't exist back then. So if you did magic, it would have been with the help of the deities. You would pick a deity who was appropriate to help with whatever issue you were dealing with, and they would sort of sponsor your magic. So we don't have specifics of what the Minoans may have done, but we can look at the deities in the Pantheon and make some educated guesses about, who they would have asked for help and that sort of thing.
I guess for me as well, giving offerings means you've asked for something, and even that in itself is kind of a magical request, isn't it? So if there is that amount of offerings, the magic would seem to go hand in hand for me.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to think of my relationship with deity as like transactional, because the gods are not cosmic vending machines. You don't put in an offering and out comes the goodie.
I like that.
But yeah, I mean, I tend to look at it this way. So we have, for instance, elder relatives whom we respect and revere and who are kind of above us in various amounts of wisdom and skill and that kind of thing. But we also love them, right? And so to me, it's not a whole lot different. Giving an offering to a deity is not a whole lot different than baking cookies for grandma. It is a physical manifestation of my love and respect and regard for the deity. And because it's a relationship that goes both ways. And so presumably if I have an ongoing relationship with a deity, just like if I've always expressed my affection for grandma, and then I have a problem, I can go to her and say, "Oh no, I have this problem. Can you help?" And she'll say, "Of course." And it's kind of the same with deity. You have an ongoing relationship with the deity, and then when trouble comes, they help.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think relationship and respect.
Yes.
It goes hand in hand for that, doesn't it? Yeah. Brilliant. Do you think that the Minoan spirituality, the Minoan, the way that we work with it today is relevant? Does it flow through to modern times?
Oh, definitely. Definitely. Especially given current events.
You mean the world going to hell in a handbasket?
Yeah, something like that.
That's
the one. Something like that. The Minoans had a fairly unique perspective compared to other cultures in their era, right? So they were they had a a greater amount of gender equality than any of the cultures around them. Some people have suggested that they were a matriarchy in the sense of the women dominating the men in the same way that patriarchal society has the men dominating the women. I don't personally see that. I see their society, just looking at the archaeological evidence, it looks like what we might consider an egalitarian partnership society. They appear to have had what is called a sharing economy. And this involved the temples. The temples had their own livestock and their own fields. And so they had agricultural produce of their own in addition to the offerings that the people made to them. And they had huge storerooms inside the temples where they kept the grain, the wine, the oil, and all this stuff. And at regular intervals, they had giant communal feasts in which they shared out this food with all the people. Until the time of the Mycenaean occupation, there was not very much economic disparity in Minoan culture. There was a fair amount of egalitarianism. And they have even analyzed the bones from the tombs and the graves, and it looks like even the poorest people were well nourished. So the people who ran this culture made sure everybody had enough food. Nobody went hungry. And
we could definitely learn from that.
Yes. And they managed to be extremely successful while being peaceful.
Right. We can learn from that too.
Yeah. And so, and so the spirituality of the deities embodies the values of the culture. And so, it's extremely relevant if you're looking to make the world a more egalitarian, more peaceful, more partnership-based place instead of domination-based.
Yeah, we could definitely learn from all of that for sure. So if someone today is looking to start their Minoan journey, any suggestions, hints and tips to where and how they should start?
After August 26th, they could pick up a copy of Pantheon, the Minoans. And
which is the best idea ever.
Many people have aha moments like I did, where just something clicks and then they go looking for information. Ariadne's tribe has a website, ariadnestribe.com, and that kind of can lead into all the other resources. But start by picking up a book like Pantheon the Minoans and seeing which deities call to you. It can be very overwhelming to try to figure out where to start with a new spiritual path like that, because there are so many choices. And so I always suggest listening to that inner voice and kind of narrow it down. Which deity, one or two or three deities, do you feel the strongest pull to, and the greatest connection with, and focus on those. And the book offers not just all the information about the deities in the sacred calendar, but also a ritual format. So anyone who wants to do their own, and it works for solitaries as well as groups, so you don't have to be a part of a group to do it. But it offers a framework for how to do the practical part of it. Like, gosh, how do I actually go about this? What's the step by step? And so it includes that as well.
I think intuition is a big thing in all of this, isn't it? Learning to trust your intuition. And if the gods, they'll often call to us anyway, don't they? So it's about listening as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and I suspect that's what the Minoans did too. They had temples and formalized religion, but their culture was not nearly as structured as some of the ones around them. And so I suspect they did a lot more intuitively and just, following that inner voice than by rote.
Your intuition will never let you down.
Right.
So any new projects that you're working on?
Oh, gosh. This has been a year. I just finished a book of modern Minoan myths that's illustrated, lots of pretty pictures. And so I have been up to here in Minoan projects for a while. And so and this is all, even though that one was myths, really technically it's all sort of nonfiction. And so I'm looking to shift gears at this point. I've written a couple of historical novels with Minoan themes. And so my next one, I think I'm going to shift and do something focused on ancient Egypt. I have a story in mind. It's not that far-fetched, actually, because it's set during the Amarna era, which was Akhenaten and Nefertiti and Tutankhamun and those kind of people, which is exactly the last couple centuries of the Minoan era. So it's the same time period, and it's just, a few miles across the water to Egypt. I think that's going to be my next project.
The Minoan art is quite recognizable, isn't it?
Yes.
And I know you've done quite a lot with the artwork.
Yeah. It's a unique style for the era because it's much more naturalistic. Egyptian art was based on a grid. That's why all the human figures look so similar. They're all have similar sizes and proportions. And Mesopotamian art from the same era is also kind of stiff and formal. And Minoan art is much more flowing. It has a more naturalistic motion to it. And I think that's part of what makes it so appealing to modern people, because it's almost like you could reach in and touch the people in the pictures. They feel so much more real and less cartoonish. I mean, I really like Egyptian art and Mesopotamian art from that time period, but they're just very different. And so, yeah, Minoan, and it's so very colorful too.
Yes. Yeah, it's quite noticeable, isn't it? The colors that they use.
And even after this stuff has been fading for like 4,000 years, can you imagine how bright it was originally?
Beforehand, yes.
Yeah. Something that I find really fascinating is the stuff that they use to make those colors. So blue is very prominent in the frescoes. You see a lot of it. And there's evidence that some of the columns at the temples were also painted blue. This was an incredible wealth display. It was like people don't realize that today because we have blue everywhere, and it's no big deal. There were two options for blue back then for paint. One was a pigment called Egyptian blue, which is a kind of copper sulfate that the Egyptians made. It was a secret formula. They didn't share it with anyone, and they charged a premium. And the other option was powdered lapis lazuli, which was imported from Afghanistan, from the region that is today Afghanistan. So the two of those were incredibly expensive. It was not far off from painting gold on your walls, how expensive this stuff was. And so all this blue in Minoan art is like, hey, look at how well we're doing. Yeah. And then one of the other bits that I really like, and it's not so prominent now. So the Egyptian blue and the lapis, those are inorganic compounds, right? They're mineral pigments. And so they don't deteriorate over time. They might fade a little, but they still sit there. So most people have heard of a dye called Tyrian purple or Phoenician purple. It's made from a sea snail, from a tiny gland in a sea snail. In the Eastern Mediterranean, this is how the Romans got it. Apparently, the smell is even worse than the pot. So the Minoans made this stuff as early as 1600 BCE, maybe even earlier than that, long before the Phoenicians did. They had it's called murex. The type of sea snail is called murex, and so it's called murex dye. And the Minoans had dye works on a couple little islands off the coast of Crete, and it's hypothesized that they did that to like keep it away from civilization because it smelled so bad.
Worth it for the color, obviously.
Right. And so it makes this sort of deep burgundy red to purple dye, and it was also incredibly expensive. The records that we have on those clay tablets show that they dyed wool fabric and sold it. And so that was part of how they became wealthy. But recent analysis shows that they also used that Murex dye in their frescoes. They painted it. They painted saffron crocus flowers with it because those are purple. They're lavender, a deep lavender color. But nobody had figured this out because Murex dye is organic and it biodegrades. And so it had faded far more than any of the other colors in the frescoes until it's practically invisible on some of them. And you have to get really close in really good light to see the faint remnants of it. But they were like, gee, what is this? And someone analyzed it. And it turns out that, they had also done that. And so we think the Murex and the saffron crocuses both were probably sacred to the sun goddess. So there was no really separation of the sacred and the mundane. They probably didn't even have the concept of mundane. To them, the entire world was permeated with the gods and the divine. So it would have been nothing at all unusual for businesses to be associated with deities.
I think on the squished snails, we'll finish up there. What a perfect ending on squished snails. Thank you so much, Laura. Absolutely fascinating. And I think it's brilliant that you are bringing it all back to life as well. Definitely something worth investigating. For anyone that's interested, do have a look at Laura's website and the books and all of Laura's artwork. Fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone watching and listening. Do join us again next time on the Pagan Portal podcast.
You have been listening to the Pagan Portal podcast, a Moonbooks Publishing production. For more information, please visit our website.